Okay, everyone, can we take a seat and let's get our session started? So I know everyone's anxious to get to 5 o'clock, but we have an awesome panel here for the next hour and a half. My name is Jennifer Dupont. I'm the head of technical environmental affairs at Equinor Wind. Brian Gervelis and I were supposed to be co-moderating this session, but unfortunately you're stuck with me because he is not able to make it today, but we have some of his wonderful Inspire colleagues here. And I think, you know, as I've talked to Brian a little bit about the thought behind convening this panel, it really is a panel of people that have been both on the planning side but also the doing side of these fish and benthic monitoring surveys. So we're really excited to have folks from the academic, the resource manager, nonprofit side coming together to talk about actual case studies and examples and the lessons learned from the development of these programs. They've worked on projects that have steel in the water, like Block Island Wind Farm, and then also the ones that are in the pre-construction and planning phases, such as Empire Wind, which is one of Equinor's projects off of New York. I'm going to let each person come up. They're going to introduce themselves. They're going to give a 12 to 15-minute talk that's listed in the agenda on your app. And then we'll bring everybody up and do a moderated Q&A. So please submit those questions as you're thinking of them in the app as we go forward here. We've kind of broken this into two parts. So we're going to start off with Dara and Annie going into some of the technical pieces of these surveys, focusing on the BOEM guidance, the robustness of survey design, and how we detect and quantify change with the design principles that we have. And then Sarah, Julia, and Dave will go into detail on some of the specific projects and case studies and really focus on the stakeholder engagement, collaborative processes, and interfaces between industry, regulators, science as we go forward. And so we're really thinking about what we've learned and what we need to do going forward here. So again, ask the questions in the app, and I would like to have Dara come on up and get us started. And that is up and ready for you to go.
It's all ready to go. Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Dara Wilber, and I'm going to be talking about what was done at Block Island Wind Farm, which was, I think, the only fisheries monitoring study that is currently completed. So we had some study designs that were in alignment with the BOEM guidelines, and what I want to focus on is how some elements of those designs influenced our interpretations of study results. So, it was flawless. I could not screw it up. It's not my first talk, but you'd think it was. So the BOEM guidelines concentrate on identifying the dominant species in an area, their distributions, collect enough information so you have less uncertainty about those parameters, and also being able to quantify substantial changes between baseline and operation time periods. So it's clicking here, it's not there. Okay. So the ROSA guidelines concentrate on similar aspects of abundance. They also include some other parameters like the demographic information, size distributions, weight, diet, that type of thing, and also environmental variables such as temperature, bottom depths, and habitat type. So you notice the emphasis on abundance in both of these sets of guidelines. And in the BOEM guidelines, they go into the different gear types that can be used. And you notice that most of these are extractive gear types, with the exception of imagery that can be used to look at shellfish. And within each gear type, there's some suggested protocols for looking at how to conduct the methodology, the statistical tests that would be appropriate, the timing of when to sample, both in terms of the season or the duration of the study, the suggestion to work with the commercial fisheries, both in the design of the study and in conducting the study. And there's more information about the types of data to collect and how to effectively sample with protected species in the area. At Block Island Wind Farm, we were coming up with these guidelines 10 years before BOEM had put out their instructions. And we came up with two sets of surveys, the autotrawl survey and a ventless trap survey, both using a Backy design. So these were extractive methods. As you're probably aware, Block Island Wind Farm is a very small pilot-scale endeavor. It's constructed 5 kilometers southeast of Block Island. It's only 5 turbines, 60 megawatts total, and it's in 30 meters of water. So the fisheries in the area were gillnet, demersal trawling, and a lobster fishery. And the commercial fishermen were very interested in knowing how the construction and operation of this wind farm would affect their fisheries. So hence, we had these two surveys, the bottom trawl and the ventless trap survey. They were conducted over 7 years, and they partnered with commercial fishing industry, both in designing the studies, having the captains of commercial vessels and their crew on board, and we had scientists there to process the catch. We adapted the monitoring designs based on feedback we got from the commercial fishermen and published our results in peer-reviewed papers, and I can help you get those if you would like that. The study design elements that I want to talk about today, in large part, have to do with the location of reference areas. So with the demersal trawl survey, we had 2 reference areas, one east of Block Island and one south of Block Island. And this was pretty much at the insistence of the commercial fishermen who were helping us with the study design, in that they knew there would be logistical constraints when we're out actually doing the sampling, and having 2 reference areas was sort of built in as a buffer for anything that might be encountered in the field at the time of sampling. So I'm going to run straight into the results. Over the 7 years of the study, this was monthly sampling conducted in all 3 areas, 2 trawls per area. There were nearly 500 tows over those 7 years. Over 750,000 individual fish and invertebrates were collected. We had a diet study that was part of the survey, where we looked at gaddids and flounder diet components, and fish condition was also studied. But going back to that abundance metric, this is a typical graph of how we had spatial and temporal variation in the catches. The monthly catches are on the x-axis, and the catch rates are on the y-axis. And here you can see with winter skate, there's seasonal fluctuation, and also the winter skate tended to be occurring in the southern reference area. That's the green bar here. Those 2 gray stripes are the time periods when construction was occurring. The longfin squid, again, a lot of seasonal variation on when they were captured, and they tended to be caught in a different reference area, the eastern reference area. And then Atlantic herring, we see a different spatial temporal trend, in that there's not really a favored area where they're caught, but over the 7-year course of the study, they were just declined in abundance year after year, which was consistent with the regional catches in the area. So all of this is to come back to, we had a very robust sampling design, monthly samples over 7 years, 500 tows, 750,000 individual fish and invertebrates collected. And the minimum effect size of this study averaged between 40 to 63% change. for the 6 species that were collected consistently enough to do a BACI type of analysis. So this means this is the background level variation in catch rates between the baseline and the operation time period, between the 2 reference areas. So if you're looking at an impact that's smaller than this percentage, it's not going to come out as a significant BACI result because of the background variation being as high as it is. So one of the take-home messages is that an abundance metric alone is not a very sensitive tool for looking at an impact. We were fortunate in that we incorporated other metrics, so we're able to look at whether the diets change between baseline and operation time periods. Did fish condition change? Those things are a little bit more targeted on a mechanism of impact. So moving on to the lobster study, it was also conducted over 7 years. From May through October, we had nearly 12,000 traps that were sampled, 2,000 trawl arrays, and a trawl array is 6 traps. And the reference area in this study was represented there in the far right-hand corner as the far field north and the far field south site. The reference area was selected by the commercial fishery because this is their fishing ground. The lobster fishermen wanted to know how construction and operation of the wind farm would affect lobsters on their favored fishing grounds. So that's where we set the reference areas at 2 replicate blocks. There are 2 replicate blocks near the wind farm. And again, we had large sample sizes. Nearly 45,000 lobsters were collected over the 7 years. Those are the 7-year totals for rock crab, Jonah crab. So again, large sample sizes. The take-home message from the reference area selection for the lobster study is that because we're using the fishing grounds as a reference area, this is favored habitat for the lobsters. It happens to be about 10 meters deeper than the habitat near the wind farm. And with depth, you get cooler water temperatures. So on any given month, those are 7-year monthly averages plotted there. There's about a 2 degrees C difference, it being 2 degrees cooler on the fishing grounds than at the reference area. And temperatures largely influences lobster movement and reproductive behavior. So our catch rates for lobsters were fairly similar in terms of the decline. There was a decline in all sampling blocks between the baseline and operation time period. Near the wind farm, it was 0.8 lobsters per trap, and in the reference area, it was 0.9 lobsters per trap. So that's, in absolute terms, that's a very similar decline in lobster catches between baseline and operation time periods. And this is consistent with a decline that's occurring throughout southern New England in other independent surveys. When you look at these data, though, as a proportion of the total catch, because there's a larger population or larger abundance of lobsters in the reference area, the decline was a smaller proportion of the overall catch. And in terms of doing a BACI analysis, this turns out to be a significant interaction term. So the lobster results in terms of catch rates yielded a result that's consistent with the wind farm impact. But at the same time, it yields a result that cannot be teased apart from the fact that lobsters during this time of a declining fishery are moving to cooler, deeper, and in some ways more northerly habitat. So we had 2 confounding results, and we satisfied the question of the lobster fishery, what was happening on their lobster grounds during construction, during 3 years of operation. But we, in hindsight, would have liked to have had another reference site that would have been located on habitat that was similar to the wind farm. The nice thing about the lobster study is we had a whole slew of other parameters that we looked at. And none of these parameters are dependent upon using the overall catch rate to analyze them. So we're looking at like the prevalence of shell disease. So that would be a proportion of the lobsters that had diseased shells. Same thing with cull status, which is a missing claw. Oviduary status, the size distributions, the sex ratios, all of those parameters are independent of the overall catch rates. So we did have good results that we could look at in terms of looking just at the wind farm impact using these metrics. So I'll wrap this up by saying one of our take-home messages is that in other studies that we're currently involved in, we are trying to move towards using less extractive techniques. I was really struck by Chief Wallace's remarks this morning about either you can do harm or you cannot do harm. And when we are extracting and basically killing so many organisms, we need to make sure that the information that we gain is going to be informative. And we have moved more towards imagery, videos, eDNA, acoustic telemetry to monitor other wind farm projects that we have. We're also, when we do extractive designs, we make sure that we're not relying solely on abundance, which we did not do at Block Island, but we just found that it was so important to have those other parameters incorporated in the designs at Block Island. So we could include condition, reproduction, diet, all that type of thing. The consideration of what the ramifications of site selection for the reference areas is very important. And because reference areas are hard to locate, given how crowded things are getting, we're moving more and more towards bag designs, the gradient designs, so that you can look at the impact with distance. So I'll leave it there and thank, first of all, our fisheries partners who were consistent throughout the 7-year study in both surveys and really helped us bring in high-quality data. So that's it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Annie Murphy. I am going to try to find my slides here. Yep. So I'm an ecosystem ecologist at Inspire Environmental. Sorry, doing too many things at once. Okay. And part of my job is to develop benthic monitoring plans for offshore wind. So we're shifting a little bit from fisheries plans and data to talking about how benthic monitoring plans are developed. The title of my talk is Requirements and Challenges When Surveying Benthic Habitats and Introduced Hard Structures, but I think instead of saying surveying, let's talk more about developing plans to survey. I want to acknowledge my co-author here, Leanne Allen Jacobson. She's also at Inspire. She couldn't make it today, so I'm giving this talk on her behalf, but we work closely together on these plans. So benthic monitoring programs in regards to offshore wind and monitoring the influence of offshore wind on benthic habitats, they must comply with regulatory and permit-specific requirements. And these requirements evolve as that project evolves and goes through the permitting process. So in addition to these compliance requirements, there are other things that we can check off the list for these benthic surveys. So enabling benthic monitoring plans to also answer local, not only local scale questions, but also regional scale questions. There's an opportunity here to do that. However, currently, there's a disconnect between that in the absence of coordination across lease areas and across projects. And a lack of established regulatory guidance, this opportunity to kind of scale up is missed because there's not a lot of standardization across projects. So in developing these monitoring programs, we use the scientific process. We first think about what do we expect is going to happen to the benthic habitat, and using that expectation, we design studies to see if those expectations are true, and maybe some unexpected expectations happen. So these are designing hypothesis-driven studies or objective-driven monitoring programs. We have to think about and consider changes that are ecologically meaningful. This is where stakeholder engagement comes in, regulatory agencies included. Identifying clear, measurable, and meaningful targets are important. Identifying, I have this sort of in italics, so important ecosystem functions. So this is up to how do we value this ecosystem? What's valuable in our mind for this ecosystem to function, how it's functioning? Setting thresholds is important. What's an acceptable amount of change? We know that change is happening when we install new structure into the seafloor. And then identifying regulatory endpoints. I think it's really important that these monitoring programs and the data that are coming out of these monitoring programs result in informed adaptive management. I don't think we need to keep studying things once we get information about those things. We should learn and then adjust and ask different questions. So adaptive monitoring should be a piece of these programs. So in my mind, I think about benthic monitoring as having sort of three prongs that we can hope to integrate across in these monitoring programs. The first I mentioned in the beginning is this compliance monitoring, where we're looking for any adverse or unexpected consequences. So perhaps we're concerned, or stakeholders are concerned that an invasive species is going to colonize these structures. We need to monitor for that adverse impact. Or perhaps there will be over-enrichment on the surrounding seafloor, lots of organic matter getting to the seafloor, causing too much respiration and not enough oxygen. So we should monitor for that. Those are compliance monitoring questions at a local scale. Then there's research monitoring, so thinking about causality and going a step further and thinking about linkages across ecosystems, so from the water column to the structure down to the seafloor, from the water column to the structure to the higher trophic levels, so food web linkages, energy flow, also biodiversity shifts, that at a regional scale. So we're scaling up and thinking about poleward shift in species. And then finally, there are company-specific goals that can be incorporated into the monitoring. If a company, a developer, is interested in testing nature-inclusive design, for example, and it needs to understand, is it worth it, or is it what we expect is going to happen when we include nature-inclusive design structures, does that actually happen? So monitoring is important for that, and setting those goals and developing plans to monitor those. So taking a step back and thinking about our expectations when we think about installing new structures on the outer continental shelf of the Western Atlantic in terms of benthic effects. So there can be kind of two schools of thought. So there's a shift. The first bullet is talking about a shift in the benthic community diversity and the structure. So who's living there? And that top panel is showing that succession over time. So you install a new structure, things start colonizing, you have the pioneer species that come in first, and then it progresses over time and matures. So that's one change. However, there's also another change associated with that community that we think about is changes in the function of that community. So not necessarily who's there, but what are they doing and how quickly are they doing it? So what are the rates that they're doing it at? So that's kind of the bottom panel, what that's showing, where the colonization, the epifauna that's growing on these new structures, they're serving a top-down effect. So most of them are grazers, suspension feeders, and recyclers. So they're pulling energy to that structure in the form of phytoplankton getting eaten. And then a lot of that energy gets shuttled to the seafloor, respired by microbes. They're also serving a bottom-up function where that benthic community, that epifauna, can serve as important food resources to higher trophic levels. So monitoring not only who's there, but how much, and feeding that how much information into ecosystem models, I think is really important and should be incorporated into benthic monitoring plans. And as we think about shifts in that benthic function, we need to estimate biomass, or how much of the dominant species at least, in order to inform these ecosystem models. So using imagery-based approaches is possible. And then ultimately integrating these benthic data that we're collecting in benthic monitoring plans and programs with the fisheries monitoring data as well. Okay, so I wanted to show some data. So this is that first chunk of benthic effects. So who's there and how does it change over time? These are data collected with imagery at the CVOW wind turbines down in Virginia, or off the coast of Virginia. I'm showing on the x-axis distance from the monopiles, and each panel is a year. So 2020, 2022, and 2023, and distance from moving across the x-axis, and number of observations. So don't worry about the colors, it just gives you a sense for how the type and the number of species changes over the years, and with distance from ultimately the food source for these organisms that are living on this new structure, that scour protection layer. So this is at the base of the turbines. And then when we consider the turbine foundation itself, this again is set up similarly a little bit. Each panel is a year, and I'm showing number of observations, again, 2020, 2022, 2023, number of observations on the x-axis, and depth, so water depth on the y. So as you might expect, there's a gradient with water depth in terms of types of species that live there. Again, don't worry about the actual species. We can just, look and see that species composition changes over the years. And we expect this to change for a number of years. So when is enough enough? I mean, there's studies that show that species composition continues to shift over 20 years of monitoring. So is it really important to understand those shifts and that dynamic, or should we consider just their function, And then another topic that I wanted to kind of illustrate with the CVOW data is leveraging benthic monitoring techniques to get information about mobile fish. So this is, again, data collected down at CVOW in Virginia. I'm showing, these data were collected with a really small, not very high-tech underwater drone, and it's really hard to collect or analyze these video for benthic species without getting distracted by all the fish. So we also count the observations of fish. And so this is showing fish diversity with water depth, just 1 year of data. All right, so bringing it back to challenges in developing monitoring and using monitoring data at U.S. leases. So currently, as I said before, these monitoring plans are being developed on a project-by-project basis. It's the developer's responsibility to develop or create these plans, very compartmentalized. Some plans focus on certain questions, local questions. Others focus on other questions, and that makes it challenging to scale up or use these data to answer regional questions. There's a lack of intentional coordination across leases, although I heard that New York Bight leases are getting together often to talk, hopefully, about benthic monitoring as well as fisheries. I know fisheries is usually the topic of discussion. And there is an increased effort over the past 5 years since I've been working in this world to enable regional science. So RWSC, obviously, ROSA, they're getting together and they're trying to provide guidance, make sure that the monitoring that is being proposed and being conducted can be used not just at a local scale, but across leases. In general, there's no published requirements or guidance or recommendations from regulators on benthic monitoring. It's a case-by-case basis. It evolves during the permitting process, depending on where the lease is, what the issues might be. So this makes it challenging, again, there's no standard. So to facilitate regional ecosystem scale research, I think there is a space for compliance data to feed into those questions. There has to be. But right now, this is what we're looking at. So each box is a lease. They're all different colors because they all have different monitoring techniques, all different monitoring hypotheses, different designs. And that makes it challenging to scale to an ecosystem and ask those types of questions. But if we can produce some type of standardization, now the boxes are all the same color, so there's at least some standard data being collected in a standard way. Notice that the boxes still have different borders, so there are still site-specific questions being asked and concerns being addressed through this compliance data, but at least there's some standardization. So coordinating, that will allow for these inferences to be made, and the compliance data can then feed into these ecosystem scale research questions. Obviously, data sharing across the developers, that also needs to happen if we are to think about ecosystem scale research. And then, as I mentioned before, each border is different, so maintaining a reasonable case-by-case level of case-by-case specific monitoring questions is okay and should be the case. We don't want to copy and paste over and over again. And speaking of that, we don't want to continue collecting data unless it's important to collect that data. Once we answer a question, we should move on. And these data should be used to inform management and actions to change. So with monitoring guidance, we can develop conceptual models, hypotheses that flow into our monitoring design. Now the boxes are all blue. Ecosystem scale research can use that data through ecosystem models, statistical analysis, interpretation, increasing our knowledge and improving our understanding of those ecosystem scale changes. Then we go back up to the top and say, oh yeah, we already know that now. And now we can now there's a new concern, or maybe there's a new hypothesis that we want to start testing. So that should flow back up to the guidance. And of course, the individual compliance data can increase our knowledge at a local scale. So in conclusion, there are kind of three main types or goals or objectives of monitoring. There's compliance monitoring, which is largely local scale, making sure what we expect is happening, is happening. Research monitoring, so causality, why is this happening, what's contributing to that change, so then we can predict what will happen better. And then company-specific goals, maybe that developer is testing a certain nature-inclusive design or wants to achieve a certain target for their biodiversity goals, for example. So benthic monitoring programs should incorporate all three of these. Yeah, and I guess I'll take questions after.
All right. Okay. Awesome. Good afternoon. I am Sarah Borsetti. I am part of the Rutgers University wind team. I am at the Haskin Shellfish Research Lab in South Jersey. I'm a fisheries researcher there. And today I'm going to be presenting some work done by a number of people, not all of those listed here, some on the acknowledgement slide, but broadly talking about the challenges and recommendations for offshore, for fisheries monitoring plans for offshore wind farms. So to start, give an overview of offshore wind in the New Jersey region, briefly touch on the fishery monitoring plans, talk about our experience solely working with the Ørsted Ocean Wind 1 project and the cooperative surveys we did in that FMP, discuss the challenges and recommendations based on that cooperative research, and then end with the discussion. As many of you might be aware, New Jersey has a number of projects in advanced development. You can see that in the figure on the right, pulled from a recent news article. And I've highlighted those leases in the map on the left. There's a competitive bid process in New Jersey. We're on the 4th of 7 planned solicitations in the state. And many have talked about the fisheries monitoring plans that are required for these wind leases. Don't need to, we've been talking about these all day, but developing fisheries monitoring plans to evaluate the impact on fisheries resources. And a key part of this is involving the fishing industry in this monitoring. And so one of those fishery monitoring plans that I'm going to be talking about and that Rutgers has worked on was the monitoring plan for Ocean Wind 1, as you can see in the bottom right. So this is a plan we were working on. I say that because this was canceled in October of 2023. And we had several different surveys that we had under this FMP, some extractive, some non-extractive surveys. And I'm going to talk about those highlighted in bold. Those were our key cooperative research surveys. Briefly touching on those surveys, the first is the bottom trawl survey led by Jason Morrison and Doug Zemeckis. This was planned to be a 6-year seasonal survey, and you can see our survey design in that map in the middle within the lease area, and then we have our controls to the south. So we had designated tow alleys, and what we had done was plan to sample in areas that didn't overlap any of the turbines, scour protection. So we had certain towable alleys. We allowed the captain to make those tows in so that our survey was comparable before and after construction. This work was completed on the Durana R with captains Jimmy and Bobby Rule. You can see the vessel in the bottom left. We had a structured habitat survey. This was, again, a 6-year seasonal survey. We used a variety of different methods in the survey, and this, compared to the trawl survey, here we were looking more at structured associated species. So we used chevron traps, benthic and pelagic brubs, and rod and reel drifts. Here we had 3 different habitat types we were looking at, the middle being the turbine locations, and then 2 controls, a reef control and a sand control. Oh, and this survey was completed on the Dana Christine with Kevin Work. Our last really cooperative survey we were working on was the Atlantic Surf Clam Survey. This was done on the Joey D with Captain Eddie Platter. You can see the vessel on the left. And there was this, a modified survey dredge developed for this project. The Joey D is a little bit of a smaller vessel, so a dredge was developed that was able to hopefully maneuver a little quicker with this smaller vessel, but also can make quicker tows. The plan being that hopefully this dredge will be able to survey after development, and we can compare those samples. Again, we incorporated our design, the planned cables and turbines, and we had 2 different controls. This project, we stratified the lease, and then we had controls associated with each of those strata. And so getting on to some of the challenges and recommendations based on these cooperative surveys. The first challenge we ran into was everybody has an opinion on wind. There's, a lot of thoughts about offshore wind. So one way we kind of navigated this challenge was finding industry partners that were willing to work with us and that understood the value of this data that we're collecting. Somebody that we had kind of a shared vision, shared goals, despite maybe the entire industry may not be on board, finding fishing partners that were understanding of how important this pre-construction data is. The second challenge we faced was uncertainty in offshore wind. Some of these timelines are really uncertain, so finding captains that we were willing to work with, us. Dave mentioned this earlier in the plenary for this session. Having really honest conversations with these captains really helps build that trust and respect. So those were some of the key recommendations based on these 2 challenges we faced. The next 2 challenges we faced were the temporal and spatial scales of these surveys. So these surveys aren't 1 or 2 year projects working with an industry member. These are 6+ years. So finding captains and vessel owners that were really willing to commit to these long-term projects, right? So trying to find those captains that are willing to do these surveys multiple times of the year for many years. So we were able to find really reliable industry members, and that kind of leads into challenge 4 is we needed to be innovative for some of these surveys. So we've kind of outlined each one of the surveys, and these captains were reliable and also willing to work with us, and they know how some of these gears work and really were willing to help us innovate some of these methodologies. Looking in the middle, the surf clam dredge was really an industry initiative. It's a smaller dredge, and it's been now calibrated against the federal survey dredge. Working with the rules, there's been a lot of discussions moving forward on some of these fisheries monitoring plans on how we can do things better, right? How can we select our controls better? So using their knowledge and incorporating that into these FMPs. And then working with Kevin Work on the far picture there, for some of these structured habitat surveys, optimizing this gear, figuring out how to appropriately rig this gear, right? We go out and think that this is going to be the plan, and then we get out there and it's a totally different situation that we're running into. So these captains are really, their knowledge has been really important in these projects. The next challenge is protected species. So these fisheries, they have take coverage under Magnuson-Stevens, but the research that we're doing doesn't. So we're seeing more and more interactions with right whales, loggerhead turtles, and sturgeon. So what we've learned is really it's important to initiate some of these permitting processes early, and then also if you're not able to sample as much as you use some of these other non-extractive methods to kind of fill in some of those gaps. Things like eDNA or some of the BRUBS footage or acoustic surveys. Next up is the health and safety and environment. the HSE requirements for the vessels, crews, and surveying activities. So this can really vary depending on which developer you're working with, and we're slowly finding that out. So for Ørsted, we had a very detailed HSE plan. This price tag for HSE can really vary, again, depending on which developer you're working with, and can vary over the timeline of the project, right? So before development and during, your HSE plan may vary. So one recommendation would be to make sure you have enough, that the budget's there to cover the HSE plan, and also you have the people necessary. So I think a key thing that we learned from this project is the project coordinator is essential to assist with HSE. They can work with the vessels, they can make sure we're meeting the requirements, they can assist with reporting, so that doesn't fall onto the PIs who are trying to plan the research. So what we've learned is, we need to continue to have these effective science and industry partnerships to execute these fisheries monitoring plans. And these are our recommendations based on our experiences working with the Ørsted Ocean Wind Run project. Like I said, that was the original author list was a very small bit of our team. We've got a number of different PIs on this project. So thanks to all of them at Rutgers and Monmouth University. The captains and crews were essential in getting this work done. Number of staff and technicians at both Rutgers, Monmouth, and also the team at Ørsted, and Ørsted for funding this work. Thank you.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Julia Livermore. I'm a biologist with the Rhode Island DEM's Division of Marine Fisheries, so I'm going to be speaking a little bit about what it's like to be involved in the fisheries monitoring plan design process as one of the regulatory agencies. Our office has been involved in planning these surveys since the Block Island Wind Farm, since it was in Rhode Island, and we've weighed in on quite a few of the projects that are being conducted in the southern New England lease areas, as well as some of the ones off of New York as well, where there happens to be a good amount of fishing resulting in squid that is landed in Rhode Island. So I just want to be clear, I'm not the only one working on this. We have a full team of our staff that provide a lot of input on these survey plans as they come in when we get questions from developers. We have a crustacean lead, a finfish lead, and an entire habitat team. I'm going to be speaking mostly to fisheries resource monitoring, but our team also does weigh in on benthic monitoring as well, and we generally use the same process. So our first step, when a developer reaches out to us about what kind of work they should be thinking about conducting in a lease area, is for us to take a step back and look at our own fishery independent data, especially if it's in state waters. That's how we usually try to identify what species and habitats are in that area, and then we use that to that's our starting point, and then we'll pare that down when we think about what species might be vulnerable to the activities that are specifically being proposed. So an easy example here, this is the South Fork Wind Farm, and this is an area that's really important to our recreational fleet. There's a cod spawning habitat area in Cox Ledge, which is hard bottom habitat. So when they came to us asking questions about, what kind of recommendations we would make, that was one of the first things we pointed out to them. That's, I think, Area D down here in this image. So we start with that species list, narrow it down based on what work is being proposed, and we might make very different recommendations for the cable route versus what's happening in the offshore wind development area itself with pile driving noise, as opposed to just benthic disturbance and EMF being produced by a cable. We also tend to look at where fishing is occurring. We do have quite a bit of fishery-dependent data as well. Offshore in state waters, that's a little bit harder for us to figure out unless it's shellfishing activity, or the reporting requirements are a bit different, but that's another way that we can kind of identify what species we should really be focusing on when we're designing these studies. From there, so that first step is kind of us in-house as resource managers and scientists trying to narrow down our scope of interest. And then we always go to the stakeholders. That's an absolutely essential step in this process. And in Rhode Island, there are actually some specific requirements for this to happen. So I work for the Rhode Island DEM, but we have a sister agency, the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council. They're actually the lead agency on offshore wind permitting. We kind of do the resource management, they manage the space. They have something called the Ocean Special Area Management Plan for the state of Rhode Island, and that has enforceable policies within it. Those enforceable policies include requirements for fisheries monitoring, benthic habitat monitoring. We even have some requirements for how long baseline and post-construction monitoring needs to be. I think it's 2 and 2, which for us, that's generally the absolute bare minimum. We like to see more. But there are some formal requirements built into that. And another part of that process is the Ocean Stamp creates something called our Fishermen's Advisory Board. We also have a Habitat Advisory Board. So the Fishermen's Advisory Board is a group of commercial and recreational industry members that provide a lot of insight on all sorts of things throughout the permitting process, whether it's fisheries monitoring or mitigation and compensation discussions. Our Habitat Advisory Board is more scientists, research collaborators, NGO representatives, other folks that can provide really helpful input into designing things like the benthic monitoring plans as well. So we generally bring these proposals to our FAB and our HAB to get input from them because there's definitely stuff that our team has missed initially. They bring new insight to this discussion, and there's usually research questions that we haven't thought about that get brought up in those stakeholder conversations. So that's a really important process, and they generally help us. We outline what species we're really interested in focusing on, what habitats we're most concerned about, and then they help us to kind of pare down what's the research question that we really want to answer through this survey design. So once we have that question in mind, it's really important to have your surveys be hypothesis-driven. We don't want to collect data just because we're required to through different regulatory processes or just for the sake of collecting data. It doesn't really benefit anybody. As I think it was Annie said earlier, if a question's been answered, we don't need to waste time on it anymore. We need to make sure we have a specific question that we're trying to answer. And then also, can we design a study that is actually going to be able to answer that question? So the first part, I think, was it Dara, you started talking about the before-after gradient versus the backy design. So you need to think about your sampling framework. How does your question fit into that? If it's something like monitoring a response to electromagnetic fields, where we know that there is a change in the EMF signal as you move away from the cable, something like a gradient design might make more sense to assess that. We also want to have that question be specific enough that we can actually develop a power analysis to make sure we can answer it at the level of statistical power and with the effect size that we want. And I also want to highlight, this is something we've had a lot of discussions with the fishing industry on specifically. They're kind of, standards where you might have 80% power or you're testing for a 20% effect size. And that was something that our fishing industry had a lot of concerns with. If there's a 20% change in lobster catch, that might be a huge problem for them. So they generally pushed for much smaller effect sizes. And you just want to make sure that the research question and your survey design is actually going to be able to answer it at the level that you need it to. From there, we generally try to have very early discussions about data sharing in this process. There's a lot of other ongoing research, and it's important to think about whether your data will be accessible down the road. There are opportunities for your study data potentially to be used by others and vice versa. So here's just an example of a paper that 2 of my coworkers collaborated on, where data from the Black Island Trawl Survey was able to be used in conjunction with our state fishery independent trawl survey. And I think they used it with electronic monitoring data as well. But they were able to put a complete study together because that offshore wind data was there to supplement the existing data collection that's already happening. This is also really important to help improve transparency. If the data can be publicly available, that's also great. And I think Annie mentioned earlier, developers sharing the data among themselves is also really helpful. And if you are using shared methodologies, which I recommend when you can, again, it comes back to the research question. But if you are using shared methodologies, it's an opportunity to build on existing data sets and fill data gaps where you might not have been able to prior to the wind monitoring work being conducted. Another thing that we've run into quite a bit in Rhode Island, and I don't know if other states will have this issue as much as we do, But we have Narragansett Bay, which has sections of it which are Rhode Island state waters. There's some parts that are actually Massachusetts state waters. And then offshore is federal waters. And all of those agencies have different requirements and may make completely different recommendations to the developer in terms of how monitoring should be conducted. So we found it's been very effective to have meetings with NOAA staff and MassDMF staff and our fisheries management staff very early in the process to make sure we're all on the same page. We might have different time of year restrictions, and we might have to find some wiggle room to make sure that those things can actually be in line so study or the project can actually happen. So a clear example of this, so can you see my cursor? No. Over here, nope, that doesn't work, never mind. The easternmost passage here would be coming from federal waters into state waters into Massachusetts. And there are projects interested in bringing a cable route there. So we've had lots of discussions with those agencies to make sure we're all telling the developer basically the same thing, or if we're not telling exactly the same thing, we can at least get on the same page. And I will say I think the ROSA guidance has been really helpful on this front because a lot of us were involved in putting it together in the first place, but it's just been very helpful to get us on the same page right up front. And then also there are opportunities to try to align methods through having these discussions as well. So those are kind of our lessons learned. I'm gonna walk through an example of how we've actually dealt with this on one project in particular. So this is a study that is being conducted on the Revolution Wind Farm cable route, which goes into Rhode Island state waters. This is being funded by Revolution Wind and conducted by the state of Rhode Island with 2 commercial harvesters aboard their vessels. So our first step in having these discussions with the developer and designing the survey was to take a look at the cable route, which is the area in red that you can see in the image here, and think about what our fishery survey data looks like in that area. What species are we catching in our seine survey, in our trawl survey, and in our ventless trap survey, which all occur there. We knew there was hard bottom habitat as well, so we wanted to take that into account. And we knew that there was also some trawling and trap setting that was occurring in that area. So from there, we identified a few species, American lobster, Jonah crab, channeled and knobbed whelk, and black sea bass and tautog, as species that we thought might be most sensitive, that we knew were occurring in the area. And from there, we took that to the stakeholders. So we met with our Fishermen's Advisory Board on this, and we also had quite a few kind of informal meetings with a couple commercial harvesters that expressed interest in being involved and weighing into this process beyond just providing comment through that Fishermen's Advisory Board. From those discussions, we outlined that lobster and Jonah crab were going to be our 2 target species, and this is primarily coming from fears that our fishing industry has that the cables are going to create a barrier to movement. Because of that, we designed a before-after gradient survey because, as I said earlier, with a cable, we know that electromagnetic field does dissipate as you move away from the cable. So we created a before-after gradient design, and we are using the same methodology as our state ventless trap survey with some slight modifications, but this actually allowed us to do a really robust power analysis because we were able to use data using the same methods, generally in the same area. And then this also creates an opportunity for us to build on the state survey. That only takes place a few months of the year when lobster catch is high. So this survey not only allows us to answer questions about offshore wind development, but also to build on our state survey and collect data year-round. So we're getting a lot more information about the phenology of lobster in the area than we were prior to this survey being conducted. And we, as I said earlier, the effect size discussion was really important. So that 10% effect size is what we focused on in our power analysis. It is much easier to have a small effect size and a high power level when you're doing fixed gear like traps where you have a large number of traps as opposed to mobile gear with trawls. You can get a much larger sample size out of the study very efficiently. So I do want to acknowledge that up front, but we were able to really build on that state survey and learn, we're going to learn a lot more about lobster in the area beyond just the wind impacts that we're studying. One of the other things we addressed right up front in working with Revolution was to have a data sharing agreement We wanted to make sure that these data are going to be publicly available. So this is actually directly from our scope of work. Actually, I can't remember if it's the contract or the scope of work, but this is the agreement we came to with Revolution Wind, where all of these data will be publicly available. The only thing that has to happen is they have to be QA/QC'd. We don't want to give out preliminary data before it's gone through that process. So this is something that we think is really important to improve transparency and help build trust with not only the general public, but the fishing industry specifically. And once we get into the analytical phase of this project, we're just starting to collect data. I think we have about a year and a half. But we're looking forward to actually having fishermen in the room when we're doing some of that analytical work to help build trust in the survey design and the findings of the study. And then finally, I just wanted to note how we engaged with some of the other federal and state agencies on this. So we had quite a few just general discussions with them about the early design. But one of the things that we really benefited from was that Mass DMF has actually done a lot of work tagging lobsters. So I noted earlier, we're looking at changes in localized abundance around the cable, but there's a concern that lobsters may not cross the cable. So we added, this is a pretty low-cost thing that we could add on to the survey, which was a tagging element. We have stations on both sides of the cables. So if we're tagging on one side and we see that lobster on the other side down the road, it helps us to answer that question. It's a little rough, but it was an easy add-on for us to build that in, and Mass DMF was really helpful to identifying how we should go about tagging both the lobsters and then also Jonah crab, which is a little bit more difficult. So with that, I will stop talking, but if anyone has questions that don't get addressed during the panel or anything, my email's right here. I'm always happy to chat about this.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. My name is David Bethoney, and I'm sharing some slides that my staff, Michael Long, put together, and I kind of edited for this presentation, so I want to make sure I acknowledge that. And I'm here to share, a nonprofit's perspective for working on fisheries monitoring and working with commercial fishermen to conduct that research. And our region of focus here is two wind farms in particular for this presentation. It's South Fork, which is in red, and then Revolution in green there. And my organization is based, basically where you see Point Judith on that map. We're just a bit north, and the fishermen that we work with for these projects are from Point Judith, Newport, and Secaucus, which are also labeled on that map. So, why does a fishing community nonprofit want to be involved in this, and why should a developer, want to work with the fishing community? So much of the lessons learned that were already shared definitely apply to here. So I just want to take a kind of a step back and present like a conceptual version of that. So, the fishermen that fish in these areas that are going to use these gear types are experts in the species and the gears that you want to use. So you want to bring them into this type of monitoring, development, and execution of research. There's also this sense of you're developing on their backyard, their fishing grounds. So what does that mean? That means that these fishermen know these areas very well. They have lots of ecological knowledge that can help with the project. And they can also help deconflict conflict. As Sarah showed, this is a very contentious topic in the fishing industry. But if you have partners that are respected and are local, that can help with trying to mitigate some of the issues that might come up on the water, which we have experienced. Again, the impacted community is the fishing community, so there's kind of this need or desire to potentially engage with that community to potentially offset some of the difficulties created. And then lastly, cost. A fishing vessel is a lot cheaper than a research vessel from a university, and a nonprofit has a much lower overhead. So these are kind of the arguments that I would make to why to engage us in this and the benefits that can bring. We've seen them exemplified in some of these presentations, design modifications to better improve the studies, effective research platforms. You are able to conduct this research on fishing vessels. It's not something that is only in concept and not in practice. And then you really do get that community engagement and that feedback to the people that you might be impacting. So with that type of broad introduction, what do I know? What have we been doing about this? So we've been working in South Fork since 2020, conducting 4 different surveys to begin in that area. Their designs are to start 2 years before and then go through construction, and then for 3 years after operation. We use a suite of different survey methods that are really just adaptations of fishing methods that are used in the area. And then for Revolution Wind, we started with an otter trawl survey and then a lobster trap survey as well, a couple years after that. So the first thing that we encountered as a barrier and lessons learned and to overcome, Sarah touched upon this as well, so I will still give it our perspective though. So really what's going on here is that the traditional monitoring methods for fisheries impact and fisheries science generally have potential to interact with protected species. And when that happens, you need a permit for those interactions. So for our organization, we were allowed to use exempted fishing permits, which put us as part of the fishery, and those takes or interactions could be covered by the fishery itself. With all this wind farm development and the NOAA recognizing that that might actually cause a problem for the fishery if that model is followed, there was a decision to remove those permitting process, and everything would be what's called a letter of authorization, which provides no protection for protected species interaction. Therefore, you would have to go get your own permit, which could take years. So that was something that we encountered right off the bat. As Brian mentioned earlier, Brian Hooker from BOEM, that there is coverage provided by the wind farm developed from a biological opinion, but that comes much later than when you want to start these surveys. So that's what we have to start thinking about here. And then also, it's not just the permit, it's what's the risk tolerance for your organization that's going to be conducting this. If you're allowed to interact with protected species, do you still want to interact with protected species? So that's something that came up with these studies that we did. So, we started with that suite of studies I showed you, and what are we at now? So over 4 years later, so the South Fork projects were all delayed basically a year. We got one started in that target 2020, but the rest of the projects were delayed for those protected species permitted reasons. A gill net is basically a very fine mesh that interacts with protected species. So that started to occur during the project, and it created some issues. And that project was removed, and we were able to, working with the developer, Orsted, come up with some different projects that potentially had a no impact. So this is mechanical jigging as a pilot, so hook and line as a way to sample within wind farms, and then a large acoustic telemetry study. So here we had to adapt, the survey plan. How could we add value to it without having this interaction? But there is now, a hole from what was supposed to happen to what is happening. So definitely need to consider, that one going forward. And then kind of the similar vein with protected species, for Revolution, we were going to do a traditional survey with vertical lines, but because of the permitting, that survey had to be changed to one with what's called ropeless, but there's plenty of rope. It's on-demand fishing gear, so you press the button and the buoy comes up to the surface, so there's no vertical line interaction with whales in particular. So that survey had to adapt to that, and that posed 2 challenges. One, I think it's probably the largest endeavor to do this type of survey. That green area that I showed you, that's our survey footprint. So this is a new, gear type, basically, that's being used in the fishery, and it really doesn't have an established way to know, your gear loss or other problems that are going to arise with using a gear without buoys on the surface. And then also it created some difficulties with, us being a fishing community organization, ropeless gear being very divisive in the fishing community, but wanting to be a part of this research and conduct this survey. So eventually, that latter one, it won over, and we wanted to continue to do this. So, these are some severe, protected species implications that really changed these monitoring programs from where we started to where we are right now. The other major topic I just wanted to highlight is this health and safety requirements. And, the reason that I think it's worth mentioning again here is that it really requires that continuous communication and support if you want to involve the fishing community in this. There's a lot of requirements. It's developer specific, but in general, they're going to require more health and safety requirements to be a part of a wind farm survey than there is to conduct commercial fishing. So that's something that you're going to have to work on with them to address. And then a big lesson learned is that things change dramatically when you move from pre-construction to construction and operation. There's another level of permit compliance needed. There's more vessel traffic. Something that wasn't really apparent, but it should be, is that are you going to have to go through a construction zone to get to your target sampling area, which we had to do. We have to go through Revolution Wind Construction to get to South Fork. So that requires coordination. For us, it was all one company, but if it was a different company, which could happen, that's another level of coordination that you're going to have to think about. Do you go around this wind farm, or do you have to work with that developer so you don't interfere with construction when you're trying to get to your research area? So I don't want to sound negative and foreboding. So we have been able to conduct these surveys for over 4 years now. So we've been achieving those fishery monitoring goals for those surveys that are still active. And there's been a lot of great platforms and opportunities to take ideas from the fishermen, ideas from other scientists, and add them on to these wind farm monitoring projects. So one in particular to highlight is looking at the acoustic impacts of wind farms on invertebrates. So we're working with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute to monitor how that might impact lobsters. And then, we talk about non-extractive surveys, but if there's something you could do with the fish that you extract that helps other people, that could help mitigate that concern. So we've been able to work with the Commercial Fisheries Center of Rhode Island, and a lot of this fish that we're catching has been able to be donated to their seafood donation program. So that takes another level of coordination and effort, but it's some way that you could address the concern about having to catch a lot of animals and potentially have an impact. So with that, what are my closing thoughts here? It's a lot of the topics and points that have been echoed, been made from my colleagues who presented earlier. So if you want to plan this stuff, a year ahead of time is too late to start the contracting and permitting. You've got to be 2 years ahead of schedule, I would say, to be comfortably conducting these permits, these projects on schedule. When you're thinking about this, you need to budget time and a person to be in charge of health and safety. Not because it's not, it's overly burdensome, but it takes time to do it right and to address the problems or the issues that would come up. And then lastly, for us, it's this continuous engagement of the fishing community that we really think is something that can be achieved through collaborative research and fisheries monitoring. So, we've involved fishermen from design to a result interpretation. We've negotiated data sharing agreements, so we have some rights to share this data publicly, and we've been able to write community reports, we call them, which are simplified reports from the data we're collecting that we make available on our website that anybody can read. So there's these tools that can come out to help engage the community and just overall be ready to be flexible and adaptive for what comes your way. With that, I want to recognize all the students and vessels. The Ventless Trap project for South Fork is done in collaboration with the University of Rhode Island. The Revolution projects are done in collaboration with the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. So I want to recognize them and Ørsted for allowing us to work on these projects and being a good partner overall to help these continue.
Oh, God. Okay. There we go. You guys got yours working? We hope? Otherwise, we'll pass this along. I'm very impressed by all the audience questions. Oh, my God. We had a whole bunch of them prepared, but it looks like there's lots coming in. So thank you, and thank you for upvoting your favorites. So let's get going on these. This one was directed at Annie, but I think that it can go both probably to Annie and Dara. You know, the situation that we're facing in researching the offshore environment is quite complex. How might we best determine whether shifts in benthic community structures or fish community structures are the results of offshore wind development or climatic or natural changes? And anyone else can chime in too, but I'll point to both of you to begin with.
I think that's really challenging to do. I think that teasing those two stressors or impacts apart is challenging and maybe not possible. It makes me think a lot about how everyone says, oh, we need tons of baseline data. But if the baseline is shifting, how good is that baseline? I guess if you have many, many, many years of baseline data, you know how it's shifting. But that's, yeah, it's challenging. Do you have any thoughts, Dara?
I have a couple of thoughts. At Block Island, we used a bottom trawl method that was similar to what's done with the fisheries independent surveys in the area, the NEAMAP and the Northeastern Fisheries SC. Anyway, another survey. And so they have a longer timeline that sets up a baseline for us, and also we were able to look at the Block Island results and compare them to the trends in these other fishery independence studies. So for most species, we saw the same kind of oscillations over the 7 years that the survey was conducted at Block Island. So it's always good to do things in a way that's consistent with other fishery independent surveys, if it's possible.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's move a little bit into a question. I think an overall one is, you know, when you look at the lessons learned, especially from Block Island, it was a lot of effort, a lot of cost, a lot of, honestly, extracted species, right? And thinking through next projects and advice for developers going forward, what would you guys, whether it's Block Island or other ones that you've had, would you change or really focus in on going forward?
So moving forward, we've moved to non-extractive techniques. We're looking at using fish pots when we're looking at demersal fish, and using fixed gear allows us to use a bag design so we can sample up very close to the turbine, which you can't do when you're pulling a bottom trawl. We do power analyses before the studies when possible. That wasn't possible with the demersal trawl survey at Block Island, but it was possible with the lobster study. We're using eDNA, acoustic telemetry, non-extractive techniques, I think, is really the major shift in what we have been doing with fisheries.
Yeah, I think switching to some of the fixed gear methods where you can really get a much larger sample size at the trap level is also really helpful. Those power analyses, it's easier to get an effect size that's small or a really high power level using those designs where that's just really expensive to do and time consuming, and you're going to kill a lot of fish. And, you know, a trawl, there's going to be a lot of death, unfortunately.
I think another point with the extractive versus non-extractive is we're able to do some extractive sampling right now, so making sure we understand how the extractive and non-extractive survey methods are stacking up, because once the development happens, we're not sure maybe how we're going to be able to do some of the more extractive methods, so making sure we have indices to compare those two different methods.
So, yeah, I'll just, the non-extractive stuff has a place, but I want us to remember that a lot of it is experimental. It's new. It's not the traditional way that fisheries monitoring was done. So if you're thinking about how does it tie into stock assessment or regionally, how can we use it, there's a lot of unknowns there. So, think outside the box, I would say suggest, is there ways that we could use commercially permitted fishing to assess this stuff? If you have a guy that has a regular fishing net, can you direct him to use that in a way that's, in more of a survey design than a fishing design? And then you have your biases with that gear type, just as you would have biases if you only did eDNA or BROS. So I think trying to think on the other side of it too may be beneficial.
I think the non-extractive versus extractive, they're answering different questions and they're at different scales too. So I think when you're picking your method, obviously you have to consider all your permits and all the logistics behind the method you're choosing and how many fish you're going to be killing or not. You have to choose your method based on your question that you're asking. So it always comes back to that objective or hypothesis.
If there's one thing I've learned from Annie, it's hypothesis-driven questions.
Everyone keeps saying it.
All right, so let's move. There's a pretty upvoted question here. Friedland's 2019 paper indicated that most fishery stock could be assessed by phytoplankton and zooplankton abundance. Why is there no monitoring of phytoplankton? And do you think that this conclusion will hold with offshore wind development?
I have not read that paper, so I would definitely like to learn more about this. Yeah, no. Are you familiar with that?
We should be doing, I kind of missed the question, but I think it's, why aren't we monitoring phytoplankton, zooplankton? Yeah, so we should be. There are projects that are doing that. Sunrise Wind is monitoring phytoplankton. We didn't talk about that, or zooplankton. And UMass Dartmouth is doing a trawl survey that does larval trawl. So there are some projects out there that are doing it, and we absolutely need to be looking at the larval fish as part of these fishery monitoring. I think that's something that's been overlooked for a lot of sites.
All right, a couple questions also around stakeholders and fears that these studies that are funded by developers are truly independent. How do you guys talk through that, or get through those kinds of components and continue the trust in the science here going forward? Who wants to start?
I think a key part of that is having some of the industry members involved in these projects, right? If they're the ones, the research, the vessels, the research is being done on their vessels, and they're industry leaders, I think that speaks volumes. Some of these people are on, management council, so people are looking to them, and the research, some of this wind research is being done on their vessels, and I think engaging those industry members is kind of the first step to the rest of the industry seeing, okay, this science is being done by people that we trust.
I'll add to that, the data sharing agreements that I think we all shared is huge. The ability to share, summarize data or any of the data for our own reports and not having it to be all through the developer, those types of negotiations into the contract go a long way to helping people understand what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And one thing we're going to try with the ventless trap survey data that I was talking about was to have the fishermen actually in the room when we're doing some of the analytical work too, not only collecting aboard their vessels so they can see how the data collection is working, having them in the room when we're designing the study, but also when we're figuring out what the findings are, having them be a part of that process as well.
And I'll add, at Block Island, we had about, I think, 7 questions that were asked by the lobster fishermen that were not part of our original design, and we went back and used the data to answer those questions and included all of that in our reports and in our peer-reviewed paper.
All right, and I think Annie and Julia, you guys both mentioned, once we've got the data to answer potential compliance questions, we should, move on. So there were a couple questions around, have any of those questions been answered? Is there anything we need to be moving on for? Is it too early for that? And what would you project outward as examples of, okay, enough data, let's move on?
I think we're in a new venue, right? So we've all been talking about the Western Atlantic. Most of the data we have are from the North Sea that's been published. So I don't think many of the answers are available yet, so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The context I brought it up in, what I was thinking about is, we have a cable study happening in our West Passage. We're focusing on lobster, and we're collecting all sorts of data on other species that we catch in that survey as well. But there's another project proposed in a different part of the bay, so we might pick a different focal species for that area. The fishery is slightly different there as well, but if we learn from our first study how lobsters respond directly to those cables, we probably don't want to do the exact same survey not very far away. So it's just things like that we're trying to work through.
So another question, probably, maybe, think through it and speculate a little here, but similar to the phytoplankton, a lot of these don't seem to have the underlying physics of the water, and we had our keynote address with a lot of the physical oceanography, obviously, in particular current and wave monitoring, which clearly influence many of these fisheries and benthic surveys. Can you comment on why that is, and any, techniques or technologies that you are particularly looking forward to deploying, or things that we could do to fill those data gaps?
I can start. I think you might have noticed on the slide that we had for all the different surveys, we aren't necessarily looking at just one resource. We're kind of looking at the environment and the resources in them, right? I just hear Josh Kohut in my head being like, the ocean moves and the fish are in them, so we need to make sure we're understanding that. So that's a big part of our fisheries monitoring plan, is making sure we understand that the environment and how it's changing and how that's influencing the resources we're looking at. I think another question that was maybe listed and kind of related to this is things like the current, like how is the current impacting the brubs and the bait plume associated with it. And so a lot of those things we're putting sensors on, so we make sure that we're looking at how the environment is impacting this survey gear and what we're seeing using the different methods.
I'll say that. So we are measuring, connectivity, temperature, depth on these surveys, and we're doing all that stuff too. I just didn't talk about it, but I guess I would say too, it's like you have to temper your expectations of what you expect the developers to pay for fishery monitoring plan. This is, it's not, they can't solve everything. There's a lot of stuff I wish that we could do, but there's like specific scopes and objectives for these monitoring studies to get through your permitting, and we can't answer all the questions, unfortunately.
So it's apparent that species composition on these offshore wind infrastructure will change over time. Are these changes good, bad, neutral? How do we tailor messages to various audiences that have, different perceptions of what good, bad, neutral might be? How do you guys approach that when engaging with external stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a question that hasn't been answered for artificial reefs yet, and they've been around for decades. So it depends on your perspective. If you know where the great fishing spot is and people pay you to take people to that great fishing spot, your value has gone down because now we have this big turbine saying this is a great fishing spot. Right? So that's not, and for some people that's not good, but for other people, wow, I know where to go fishing now because, and also we don't know whether we're concentrating the fish, whether it's the attraction versus production, which is it? Are they being attracted, or are they actually producing in this area and giving back to the fishery population as a whole? It's unanswered in my mind.
I guess we've always kind of approached it with the public that there are going to be some species that benefit and some that don't. If you're worried about squid, they tend to like open sandy bottom habitats. Maybe adding hard structure is not going to be great for them, but we also have species like tautog and black sea bass that are structure oriented that are definitely benefiting, and we're seeing a lot of them around the Block Island Wind Farm. So I think it really depends on your perspective. Obviously it is changing the ecosystem, but whether it's good, bad, or neutral, I think kind of depends on who you are and what your perspective on the situation is.
Yeah, I'm echoing what Julia just said. It's a change, and at what scale is that change? I think that's really important to consider. But we all keep talking about stakeholder engagement, so you have to use that tool to figure out what is valued there and when.
Awesome. All right, well, I think we are just at our time, right? 1 minute. Look at that, I got the thing. So I want to give a big round of applause to our panel members. Thank you so much. And find them for a drink if you have any other questions, because there were a lot in this app that did not get asked. So thank you, guys.
Okay. The poster session is starting over in the fishbowl room, but I did want to make an announcement about the